Pomej. Criminal Nights on Kepler-186F. Sherlock Holmes, The Galactic Cases, Episode 5. Based on the characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go audio production. "We have a visitor, sir," First Officer Tornot reported to Captain Decker on the bridge. "It's a Sergeant Canfield from one of the 6 exoplanets orbiting Kepler-186. He's requesting landing clearance for the cargo bay of Ultimo 1. "Grant it," ordered Decker. "I'm curious to hear what he has to tell us about the descendants of the exiles living on the surface there." Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, who were also present on the bridge, wanted to know more about these exiles. "Is exile still a possibility even in modern times?" asked Holmes. "Yes," replied Tornot. "However, that was still a punitive action from the previous century, before either I or the captain were born." "Let's all go down to the cargo bay," Decker suggested, already heading towards the lift. "Then I can also find out what brings the sergeant to us." In the cargo bay stood a sleek space glider, resembling a private aircraft without landing gear, adorned with a fire-breathing dragon on its side. A young man in a dark grey uniform with bright red piping emerged from the fearsome-looking vehicle. After crisply saluting Captain Decker with his hand raised to his peaked cap, he made his formal report. "Sergeant Canfield from the 12th Regiment, currently stationed on Kepler-186F. Colonel Sutton sent me to obtain a bit of bromicium from you, sir." "Approved. Tornot, instruct Elmer to have 1 kilogram of bromisium brought here." "Might one ask what exactly this bromisium is?" inquired Holmes, who as always was eagerly awaiting new information. "It's a legal drug that makes long stays on distant planets more bearable," explained Decker, then turned to Canfield. "How are the surface dwellers getting on at Kepler-186F, Sergeant?" "Still totally clueless and superstitious," he grinned, revealing a row of pearly white teeth. "Surface dwellers?" Holmes repeated. "May one learn more about that?" Sergeant Canfield readily provided information. Over 100 years ago, a bunch of incompetent politicians, along with their cronies and kinfolk, were abandoned on Kepler-186F with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The chaps before my time at the underground military station made quite a sport of observing them. What started as pure curiosity turned into an experimental interest, which is now even supported by our government. "Even today?" wondered Tornot. "Oh yes, indeed. It was quite remarkable how quickly humans forget their roots," Canfield continued euphorically. "While the first generation still tried to rebuild spaceships, which naturally failed spectacularly without know-how, tools and construction plans, the second generation already confused fact with fiction, though they reproduced rather diligently. The third established a medieval society, and the fourth, now ruling generation, already believes in ghosts, dragons, and a coming saviour called Spacius Shippus. It's truly hilarious what's become of this degenerate political offspring. Ha ha ha!" Tornot joined in the sergeant's laughter, whilst Holmes and Dr. Watson merely lowered the corners of their mouths in a dignified manner. "I wouldn't judge these people so disparagingly if I were you," Holmes remarked with raised eyebrows. "Especially not as an outsider. It's really quite easy to mock those who are ignorant." The sergeant fell silent, and Tornot, too, now looked at the ground with a hint of embarrassment. "I am of the same opinion," Dr. Watson agreed with his friend. "You said these people received neither tools nor anything else, and yet they managed to build a new society, even if it is one that lags far behind the 19th century from which we both originate. Besides, these ignorant descendants of the outcasts can hardly be blamed for their ancestors' incompetence. That's nothing short of the worst kind of collective punishment," Holmes objected, shaking his head. Captain Decker, who had until now nobly refrained from commenting on this delicate matter, rejoined the conversation. "Why don't you two gentlemen pay this society a visit yourselves?" "For what purpose?" Holmes probed suspiciously. "Just to see how these people live. You could try to raise their standards to match your century," Decker suggested. "And you are a gifted fencer, as you told me, Mr. Holmes." I think that's an exciting idea, Dr. Watson enthused at once, nodding encouragingly to his friend. Yes, that will certainly be fun again, Sergeant Canfield said cheerfully whilst rubbing his distinctive chin. Very well, Holmes agreed. So be it. I shall help these poor people bring light to their dark ages. And I shall naturally support you in this, Dr. Watson readily offered. Our colonel will certainly be eager to see this leap in innovation, remarked the sergeant. Hehehe, Tornot chuckled to himself. After Elmer had brought the Bromesium, Dr. Watson and Holmes boarded the space glider, which contained comfortable seats that made travelling in it a true pleasure. The sergeant saluted farewell, sat down in the pilot's seat, and, shortly afterwards, took off through the opening hatch of the cargo bay. For someone from the 19th century, you don't look excited at all, almost bored, Canfield remarked in wonder. Well, Holmes revealed to him, nature has given us the gift of consistently appearing only half as excited as we actually are, which now seems to give our apparent indifference the guise of professional reserve. One could certainly say that, Dr. Watson chimed in from behind, and in our composed manner, we would like to learn more about your planet. Kepler-186F orbits a red dwarf 600 light-years from Earth at a distance of 52.4 million kilometres, and takes only 130 Earth days to complete one orbit. Although its distance to its central star is considerably less than that of Earth to the Sun, it receives less energy in direct comparison, and therefore lies within the habitable zone, explained Canfield, looking through his windscreen, through which his passengers could also see what appeared to be an entire planetary system lining up before them. So we can breathe there without a helmet, Holmes knew. What language do the exiles speak? English, though the refined nobility like to sprinkle in a few French words. Shortly afterwards, after penetrating the atmosphere of the outermost planet, the sergeant began his landing approach. The desert ground opened up and the space glider carefully descended vertically into it. No sooner had it touched down than the landscape swiftly closed above them, leaving no indication that an entire military station lay concealed beneath. Everyone disembarked and was greeted by an older uniformed officer who clearly outranked the sergeant. Welcome to Kepler-186F. I am Colonel Sutton. Captain Decker has already informed me of your visit, gentlemen. Thank you for your kind words, Holmes acknowledged, feeling like an intruder here as a civilian. I was an army doctor in Afghanistan, by the way, Dr. Watson mentioned, not without pride. If you need medical assistance at your station, then… The colonel interrupted him. Negative. We're merely battling current boredom. I'm almost inclined to file a complaint that the lack of combat operations is forcing us into inactivity in this sector of space. But the donated Bromesium will make our continued stay more bearable, and of course, the surveillance of the natives. How can we best get to the heart of the matter? Asked Holmes, who wanted to take action without further delay to bring necessary progress to this society. We've built an underground railway to a gnarled oak tree, which we use as an exit to the surface, revealed Canfield. Have you ever been up there before? Holmes inquired of the young sergeant. Of course. Sometimes we dress up in disguise and pop in for a brief visit, stopping at a medieval pub with a buxom landlady and raising a pint of beer. And the population hasn't noticed yet that they're being observed and sometimes infiltrated by your kind? Inquired Dr. Watson, astonished. No. How would they know? We observe them with drones, birds that look deceptively real, and when we appear in person, we only do so in disguise without any technical equipment that could give us away. The colonel added warningly to the sergeant's words, and you shouldn't reveal anything either, aside from the fact that no one would believe your story anyway. Don't worry, we won't give anything away, Holmes reassured him. Will we get a medieval disguise too? Yes, indeed. Come with me to our wardrobe, where you can choose a lovely colourful outfit. And do make up a backstory in case anyone asks about your origins in detail, Canfield advised him. On their way there, they encountered several soldiers who saluted the sergeant. The generously stocked chamber of period clothing offered Spanish fashion, including white breeches with codpieces, as well as ordinary dark brown trousers and white undershirts. Holmes chose a green doublet stiffened with tow and padded at the shoulders to make them broader, comfortable brown trousers, and a belt with a sword attached. Dr. Watson donned a black doublet over a white shirt with a long collar and burgundy trousers. They covered their heads with dark caps and wore grey shoes made of rough suede. "Perfect," Canfield praised. "Now you truly look like two genuine men from the kingdom of Salmanzar IV. Currently a peaceful ruler, though that could swiftly change. Here are some gold coins bearing his image." Holmes took the coins and put them in the right pocket of his doublet. "Look through this peephole," ordered the colonel, pointing to the wall next to the door, "so we can scan your iris." An iris scan is the only way to open the gate to the oak, which serves as the entrance and exit to the Knight's world, by looking through a peephole. Confidently, Holmes and Dr. Watson took turns looking into the aforementioned hole, where their irises were captured by a blue beam of light. "Good," said Canfield. "And should anyone be lurking at the entrance, you can press a red button inside the oak tree. Then everyone within a 30-metre radius outside will receive a powerful electric shock that will paralyse them. If anyone asks where you're from, best say from across the border. That's our standard response." "There's one more thing you need to know," warned the colonel. "Up there, you'll both be completely on your own. If someone threatens or attacks you, you won't be able to call us for help." Holmes gave him an arrogant look. "I have no intention of doing so. There have been numerous dangerous situations in my life that I have mastered either alone or with my friend Watson. Unfortunately, I've already lost one of my men who lost a duel against one of those brutal knights during his time off. At least those barbarians up there arranged a proper burial for him," admitted the colonel as he led his guest to the underground railway tracks. With mixed feelings, the two Englishmen boarded the silver train that would take them to the gnarled oak. The sergeant accompanied them, grinning throughout the swift journey through the brightly lit tunnel. After a few minutes, they reached the end of the tracks where a narrow staircase led upwards, and they disembarked. "Well then, I wish you the best of luck," said Canfield laconically. "We've already got several bets going on whether both of you will return, just one of you, or whether you'll remain missing." "Play some Bitcoin on victory for me as well," announced Holmes, and climbed upwards, closely followed by Dr. Watson. At the top of the stairs, a display screen, which they already knew from the Ultimo One, showed them the surroundings of the gnarled tree. "Seems no one's lurking by the oak," Dr. Watson observed, peering through the scanner hole next to the display with the red button, whereupon an exit opened. They stepped out of the thick trunk, and the gate immediately closed behind them, no longer visible from the outside through the bark. As soon as they left the mighty trunk of the gnarled oak, they smelled wet grass, which reminded them of home. The central star gradually descended towards the horizon, turning the sky blood red, and the light made the fortress before them appear larger than its actual size of 857 metres. A blue flag with a red S-shaped serpent flew from the highest tower. The thick walls appeared forbidding and impregnable. Nevertheless, they trudged forward in good spirits along a wide dirt track, and soon the castle's large iron gate came into view. Two tall helmeted men stood before it, dressed in blue and red garments and armed with long halberds. "We don't want to mess with those chaps," Holmes whispered to the doctor. "Let's carry on to the village up ahead." A few single-storey houses with gabled roofs stood decoratively in the landscape dotted with deciduous trees. One of them displayed illuminated windows and a large sign reading "The Golden Ox." However, the painted ox beneath it looked more like a hippopotamus with horns. "That must be a pub," Dr. Watson said cheerfully. "Let's stop in there, Holmes, as I'm terribly thirsty." In a parlour dimly lit by a few lanterns, things were getting rather lively. A great many quarrelsome lads were having a right old barney between partly overturned tables and chairs over nothing in particular, and the sharp-witted detective settled the dispute by simply telling those present about Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Dr. Watson, who also knew the play from the theatre, supported him with animated gestures. All the roughnecks listened, spellbound, as they were eager to be entertained. In the end, they even gave them a round of applause. The landlord asked for their names and treated them to 2 tankards of light ale, which went down rather splendidly. "My grandfather once told me," began the chubby-cheeked innkeeper in conversation with his 2 new guests, "that every house had a flickering box in which talking puppets chattered endlessly, even about Shakespeare's works." "My grandfather always read to me from the Bible," Dr. Watson recalled with a touch of melancholy. "Oh, we have a Bible in every guest room, Doctor. Take one with 2 beds in it. It's only 1 gold piece for 2 nights full board," suggested the innkeeper, wiping his hands on his brown apron. "But payment in advance." Holmes paid, and the innkeeper led them upstairs to the first floor with heavy steps, carrying a lantern. "With these prices, you must be quite wealthy," remarked Dr. Watson as he entered the guest room. "The taxes are quite high around here. Pleasant rest." The innkeeper bid farewell hastily. The room offered 2 simple wooden beds with white bedding made of coarse linen, a table with a wash basin, and an earthenware jug full of water, a chair with a clean towel hanging over it, and prettily woven curtains at the window. While Holmes poured some water into the basin to wash his hands, Dr. Watson took the Bible from the windowsill, sat down on the chair, and began to read by the light of the lantern. "You won't believe what it says here, my friend," he said indignantly and read aloud. "In the beginning was the light bulb, then came the fluorescent tube. What blasphemy! They've rewritten the text." After drying his hands on the towel, Holmes remarked, "Consider that the ancestors of these poor people were abandoned here with nothing. That's why they wrote down the Bible from memory and added details that were important to them." The doctor closed the book. "We shall have to do quite a bit of explaining here, dear Holmes. But first, we need our sleep." The next morning, they were awakened by a trilling lark, though they weren't sure whether it was real or deployed for surveillance by the military stationed underground. In any case, it flew away when Dr. Watson rushed half-naked to the window and opened it. "The sky here is quite different from ours," he observed whilst getting dressed. "I can see 2 moons, though they might also be nearby planets. The sunrise is at least as beautiful as back home in England." "Knock, knock," came from the door, and at Holmes's "Come in," a buxom, portly, dark blonde woman in a long blue frilly dress entered the guest room carrying a tray. "Morning," she grumbled, and lifted a jug of fresh water and 2 spouted cups with steaming brew from her tray onto the table. "I'm Francine, the landlady. One of you 2 is supposed to be a doctor?" "Yes, that's me." Dr. Watson raised the index finger of his right hand. "Are you feeling unwell?" "No, thank goodness, but our king. Word has got around that a quack like yourself is staying with us. You are invited to come to the castle when the bell strikes 9. She briefly picked up the washbowl, emptied the dirty water out of the window, and waddled back out of the room. Sherlock Holmes sniffed at the brew in the cups and noted with dismay, "This isn't coffee, it's soap, and without a spoon no less. Apparently, we're meant to slurp this broth from the spouted cup." Said Dr. Watson as he washed his hands and face in the freshly filled wash basin. The Colonel wasn't entirely wrong about calling them barbarians. After tasting it, the detective allowed himself to give a compliment. "The soup is quite acceptable. I can detect carrots and potatoes as ingredients. It seems one needs hearty sustenance around here." "Oh yes," agreed the doctor. "According to the annals of history, the life of knights was apparently nothing but a constant brawl. So it's high time we teach them proper English manners," Holmes remarked, dabbing his mouth with the napkin. "Drink your soup, and then we'll set off." In their antiquated clothing, adapted to the Mediterranean climate, they made their way to the castle, passing a large clock they hadn't noticed the previous evening. This clock was as tall as a man and displayed its mechanism of various cogs on the rear side. At the front, the hands showed 10 minutes to 9. "Now look at that, Holmes." Dr. Watson pointed at the dial. "There are 14 numbers on it. This means the exiles have discovered that this planet rotates once around its own axis in 28 hours. Do you remember when the sergeant mentioned it only takes 130 days to complete one orbit around its sun? Indeed, the doctor recalled. So the people must work longer during the day, but have a shorter year in return. There must certainly be other differences. One more thing, my dear Watson. We should absolutely avoid what they call shock therapy. That is, ambushing these unknowing folk with our knowledge without any warning. I suggest we handle this in a thoroughly diplomatic manner. Very well then, Holmes, if you say so. Right on the 9th stroke of the bell, they reached the fortress. The slightly taller gatekeeper struck his halberd twice on the ground in greeting and said, "One of you is a doctor, and may relieve our king of his headache. The other one is also invited." "Many thanks," replied Holmes. "How quickly word of our arrival reached the king." "We're a quick-witted lot," claimed the guard, while his colleague grinned broadly, revealing a large gap in his teeth. Through the gate, they entered a bustling castle courtyard, where several castle maidens, in lovely red and blue garments and golden bracelets, were milking goats that were as large as horses back on earth. And instead of bleating, they crowed like roosters. "How peculiar," remarked Dr. Watson. "The milk is green. Apparently the grass here leaves quite a stain, and there don't seem to be any servant girls. The noble ladies do the work themselves." "Different planets, different customs," Holmes concluded as he strode along a light grey tiled path through an archway adorned with peculiar ornaments, several overlapping ellipses, each containing a large dot. The tiled path led them into a tall hall adorned with numerous crossed swords between large windows, where a purple carpet runner lay before them. At its end sat King Salmanzar IV upon a beautifully carved wooden throne, lined with white animal fur. Directly beside him stood a cage in which a colourful parrot perched on a small swing. Upon his dark-haired head, the monarch wore an enormous crown of pure gold. His well-fed body was clothed in a magnificent red and blue robe, and his bearded countenance reflected pain. "Salmanzar is good!" screeched the parrot. Holmes and Dr. Watson bowed and politely introduced themselves, whereupon the king made a gracious gesture with his right hand, signalling that they were permitted to approach. As they approached, the doctor whispered, "Very clever, planting a fake parrot on the king." Holmes nodded and whispered back, "That way, the army has a front row seat to the proceedings." "What's all this whispering about?" snapped the king. "Kindly examine me, for my head is tormenting me." "Your Majesty," Dr. Watson carefully began his examination by gently feeling the royal neck. "Not only do you bear the heavy burden of royal dignity upon your shoulders, but also a weighty crown upon your most noble head. Unfortunately, it compresses the cervical vertebrae and causes the headache. Therefore, I strongly advise removing the heavy crown during daily activities and wearing it only for special occasions." "A peculiar suggestion," grumbled the king, yet obediently removed his crown. "Ah, I can already feel some relief." "Your Majesty," Sherlock Holmes now addressed him, "what would you say if someone claimed that Raumus Schiffus doesn't exist? That even his name is based on a misunderstanding?" The king's eyes widened noticeably, his face flushed red, and he roared, "Good Lord! I would have such a heretic burnt at the stake immediately. Who dares to make such a claim?" "Oh, just a poor madman from across the border," Dr. Watson quickly reassured him. "Aha!" shouted Salmanzar IV. "I should immediately declare war to deal with such upstarts." "No," Holmes implored him submissively. "As the doctor has already mentioned, we're dealing with a mentally ill person who is naturally incapable of understanding the lofty concept of religion." "Well then," the king calmed down again, "he ought to be thrown into the madhouse. As it happens, I'm dealing with madmen myself. Just imagine, one of my knights was killed, but not in full armour during a tournament duel, as would be proper. No, in his bed, cowardly murdered while he slept. Scandalous." "Aha, that's definitely my area of expertise," Holmes announced to him. If your majesty permits, I am an experienced detective and have managed to solve every cowardly murder case thus far. Then accept this commission from me, detective, and find out who so callously dispatched my knight." With a fidgety gesture, he pointed towards the exit and then muttered quietly into his beard, "The jobs one comes across." Holmes muttered quietly to the doctor, "Dreadful. I suspected he merely thought his people dim-witted, but apparently he's on the same intellectual level as them. One can't communicate with the people here without being overcome by the feeling that human intelligence has hit rock bottom. To be honest, I imagined converting these heathens would be much easier," Dr. Watson admitted. After leaving the throne room, they asked a young castle maiden who was coming down a stone staircase where they might find the dead knight. At first she blushed, but then willingly provided the information. "The deceased Knight Kraskardin lies in his chamber directly above the throne room, where our beloved king resides," she chirped in a high-pitched voice, pointing upwards with a delicate hand. "I am Mademoiselle Towney, the king's favourite, and I have just paid my final respects before he is dressed for his burial." "Well, fortunate that I can examine him before then," said Dr. Watson as he hurried ahead. "What's the point of examining him? Kraskardin is beyond help," chirped the delicate lady as she shook her head, adorned with long dark curls and crowned with a golden diadem. "No, not him, Miss Towney, but all of you shall be helped," promised Holmes, "once Kraskardin's murderer is found. Who discovered him dead in his bed?" "The cook, when she wanted to bring him his breakfast beer." "Most enlightening. Excuse me, miss." Bewildered, Miss Towney watched him leave and then scurried quickly into the throne room. In the spartanly furnished chamber, Sherlock Holmes deduced from the cold, ashless fireplace that it hadn't been lit since the previous day, whilst Dr. Watson, examining the naked corpse, discovered that the victim had died from a knife wound to the heart. It must have been a stiletto. It was rammed in with masculine force right up to the hilt. You can still see its impressions on the chest. I reckon he was stabbed yesterday, ice cold and still rigid. His face shows a surprised expression that has been well preserved, the doctor recapitulated. We must find out whether the murder might be the work of one of those pleasure-seeking militants from the underworld, possibly an act of revenge, Holmes worried. We'd best try to catch one of those dodgy characters whom we can question. You mean one of those observant drone birds? The parrot? Dr. Watson sought to clarify. Very well, but we mustn't be caught talking to him, or we'll quickly find ourselves destined for the stake as well. If my assumption is correct, they'll all be at breakfast now, slurping green goat's milk, so we can return to the throne room to question the fake parrot, Holmes suggested. Indeed, they found only the parrot swaying in its cage. The creature was preening its blue, red and yellow plumage, or at least pretending to do so. Holmes positioned himself with the doctor directly in front of the cage and addressed the bird. "Hello, Colonel. Can you hear me?" "Salmanzar is good," screeched the parrot, puffing itself up. Yes, we're alone, Colonel. You can speak," Holmes hissed irritably whilst cleaning his right ear with his finger. "His name is Hackensack and not Colonel or anything like that," said a small, high-pitched voice behind him and Dr. Watson. The startled Holmes spun around and saw Towney, hesitated and inquired of her. "Have you finished breakfast already, dear Miss Towney?" "I never eat anything in the morning," she stated and tiptoed closer. "What do you two fellows want from Hackensack?" "We're great bird enthusiasts," claimed Dr. Watson. "As I discovered, Kraskardin was stabbed to death." "Oh!" escaped her pouting lips as she threw up her hands theatrically. "How dreadful!" "Who could have done this, Miss Towney?" Holmes probed sternly. "Whom would you suspect?" "I don't know," she seemed to ponder, whilst affectedly playing with her curls. "There was a tournament yesterday. Tee-hee, Kraskardin won it. Sir Grenador was terribly upset about that." "And where might I find this Grenador?" the detective now wanted to know. "I don't know," she seemed to ponder again. "Most likely by the river, where he likes to go for a swim." "Thank you, we shall return." Holmes bid farewell, and hurried out of the hall with the doctor in tow. "Salmanzar is good!" the parrot screeched after them, while Towney giggled. At the castle gate, the taller guard inquired about the success of the treatment, to which the doctor revealed, "His Majesty is feeling much better already, but we must return to him later." "Where is the river?" "Just behind the castle, so the noble ladies don't have far to go for water," explained the guard. Dr. Watson thanked him for the information and walked with Holmes to the watercourse, which was not particularly wide, nestled in an emerald green landscape. They found no trace of the bathing grenadier, but a raven landed just in front of them. "Well then," said the raven, flapping its wings a few times. "Thank heavens," said Holmes. "We were about to contact you, but the king's parrot appeared to be genuine." "Quite right!" The colonel's voice boomed strongly from the raven's beak. "We use 13 ravens, 10 larks, and 2 eagles for surveillance. If you look up, you'll see one circling above you." "Very clever," remarked Dr. Watson. "A knight by the name of Kraskadin has been stabbed to death in his bed. Is there a possibility that a comrade of your unfortunately defeated soldier carried out an act of revenge?" "Negative. We were able to observe the duel from above, and whilst it was fierce, it was fair. Therefore, I consider an act of revenge impossible, particularly since it wasn't Kraskadin who defeated Sergeant Poltop. It was a fellow named Huckervolk. So the murder is indeed a malicious act by the locals. Someone wanted to get rid of the knight, possibly to avoid facing him in the tournament, Holmes deduced. Or he was of higher rank, and the murderer now inherits his elevated position or his widow. We still need to ascertain this." The drone disguised as a bird croaked, "Warning! A castle beauty is approaching your position." After this statement, the raven fluttered away. "Hello," Towney called out to them from afar. "Do you talk to ravens as well?" "Yes, ravens are very clever," Holmes revealed to her. "You wouldn't know that, as you're still very young, Miss Towney." "I'm already 39, she claimed proudly. "That cannot be right," protested Dr. Watson. "As a doctor, I would estimate you to be no more than 18. "Hey, hey, hey!" The young lady almost split her sides laughing. Holmes whispered to his friend, "Consider that a year here lasts only 130 days. This means we must divide the young lady's age by 3, so she's merely 13. "Good gracious!" the doctor exclaimed in shock. "And she's having a liaison with the king. Why, she's far too young for that." "We'd better not meddle in socio-political affairs here, but rather focus on solving a murder case," Holmes reminded him. "We can only fight on one front at a time." Towney was still laughing, but finally composed herself and chirped, "How charming you are, Doctor! And look, there's Sir Grenadier swimming towards us, whom you were looking for." Indeed, a naked man swam to the shore, climbing out of the water without shame, whereupon Towney ran off, giggling loudly. "You are the strangers who called upon Franzine yesterday," the bather spluttered. "Indeed so," Dr. Watson admitted. "I was able to cure the king of his headache." "And what brings you here to the river?" the knight wanted to know. Pondered the doctor, then bent down, picked a flowering plant and explained. "This chamomile here. One can brew tea from it, that is, a healing herbal drink." "Never heard of it," Grenadier admitted, dropping into the grass and rolling around to dry himself off. "I always drink beer." At that moment, a castle maiden with blonde curls came running over, bringing the knight's clothing. "This is Miss Trunder, my fiancée." Grenadier introduced her and allowed her to help him dress. "Delighted to meet you." Holmes bowed before her. "May I ask when you last saw Sir Kraskadin alive, Miss Trunder?" "No," interrupted the knight, who was now wearing a blue and red doublet and blue trousers. "We shall not speak of that deceiver." "No, we certainly won't," Trunder confirmed in a squeaky voice, carefully smoothing down her red dress. "He cheated my fiancée out of victory in yesterday's tournament." "And today he lies dead in his bed," added Dr. Watson. "The great Raumus Shippus has punished him," Trunder squeaked, giving a sudden nod. "Does he always act this promptly, or was this just a one-off?" inquired Holmes. Now both seemed to ponder before their answer. apparently mentally recapping the recent deaths, before the knight, having put on his shoes, spoke up. Sometimes Raumus punishes immediately after an evil deed, and sometimes he takes his time with it. He, giggled Trunder. Might I inquire whether the noble ladies here carry daggers for self-defence? Holmes conducted an important line of investigation. No, a young lady is never armed, Grenador replied quickly. She can rely on the help of her fiancé. Well, we won't disturb you any further. Holmes said goodbye, pulling the doctor along with him, whispering to him. Those two are already suspicious. Well, I rather think they're just a bigoted couple who blame Raumus for anything they can't explain, said Dr. Watson. And this Trunder is still very young. You can make her believe almost anything. Back at the castle, they went to the kitchen where they handed over the chamomile to the cook and gave her instructions on how best to prepare a cup of tea for the king. She listened attentively. She appeared to be, by local reckoning, a 120-year-old woman wearing a white apron and matching cap, who immediately began the preparation. As she worked, she chatted with the Englishmen and told them that quarrels frequently occurred in the castle. The castle maidens fought to outdo the king's favourite, and the knights brawled at every tournament to climb higher in the pecking order. Another tournament was scheduled for today. As for who had stabbed poor Knight Kraskidin, whom she had found dead in his bed, she didn't know and wouldn't venture to guess. His fiancée had been Mademoiselle Vintalain, a red-haired beauty of 59 years. And no, normally no maiden spent the night with her betrothed, but rather returned bashfully to her chamber after the act of love was completed. Order and propriety reigned at the court of Salmanazar IV. At this, the gentlemen exchanged meaningful glances. With the small bowl of tea, Holmes and Dr. Watson made their way back to the throne room and ceremoniously presented it to Salmanazar. The doctor mentioned the healing properties of the chamomile brew, and the king curiously took a sip. "Delightful," declared His Majesty as he emptied the small bowl. "A true pleasure, Doctor. And what have you discovered about my dead knight, detective?" "It appears to be the deed of a ruthless man," assessed Holmes, whilst pacing back and forth before the throne. "A man who sought to climb the ranks and found Kraskidin to be in his way." "Excellent," praised the king. "Today, after the tournament, I expect to hear the name of this cowardly murderer. That is all. You may leave." With an episcopal gesture, as if to bless them, His Majesty ended the audience. Outside the hall, they met Towney, who seemed visibly excited. "There's another tournament today. Surely you'll be taking part." "I am an excellent swordsman," Sherlock Holmes boasted, taking the opportunity to grasp his sword, which dangled decoratively from his belt. "How lovely," Towney chirped. "Then I shall arrange for you to face Knight Grenador, to the death." "No, not to the death," Dr. Watson immediately protested. "As a doctor, I forbid it. I don't want to see any more dead people." "Well, he only needs to defeat Grenador, then he can spare his life. Tee-hey-hey," she said, and skipped away giggling with bouncing steps. "Well, we've really landed ourselves in it now," sighed the doctor. "What do you think, Holmes? Should we cut and run?" "Run away? Me? Never!" Holmes swore, showing confidence. "Don't worry, Watson. I've won far more challenging duels. I'll manage a half-grown knight like that. But first, I'd like to have a word with Miss Ventolin." In the castle courtyard, some children dressed like adults were playing with an egg-shaped ball amongst cackling goats. Drawn by their laughter, Holmes and Dr. Watson approached the merry group of girls and boys dressed in blue and red. "I haven't seen such lovely children in quite a long time." The doctor drew their attention, whereupon they paused their game. "Would you happen to know where we might find Miss Ventali?" "Of course," answered one of the girls. "At the cemetery. She's choosing a grave." Of course, for her fiancé, Holmes knew. The girl continued. "That's where the dead sleep until the great spaceship comes to collect us all." Now Dr. Watson became angry and called out, "Now listen carefully, children. There is no—" "Watson," Holmes interrupted him quickly. "Let the little ones keep their childlike faith. "There's no what?" asked a boy who was riding one of the goats. Holmes smiled benevolently. "There's no reason not to continue playing merrily with your ball." The children watched them leave with slight irritation, shrugged their shoulders, and resumed throwing the ball to one another, whilst the gentleman departed through the castle gate. The cemetery lay beside a large rock which showed clear signs of being worked. It had been carved into a round shape that was presumably meant to represent a spaceship. The unknown artist had even chiselled an indentation for a door that could lead nowhere. All around, inscriptions on circular gravestones revealed who rested beneath. "Look here, Holmes, this is where the fallen soldier lies," the doctor observed and read aloud. "Pultop came from beyond the border and fell in a duel to Sir Huckevolk on the 12th of Aprilis 336. Properly done." Holmes nodded and pointed at a red-haired woman standing next to a black-clad man with a spade further ahead. "That must be Miss Ventali speaking with the gravedigger." Slowly they approached the lady, who was also wearing glossy black mourning attire, and watched the gravedigger at his work. Dr. Watson introduced himself and Holmes, then said solemnly, "Please accept our sincere condolences for your loss in this darkest hour, Miss Ventali." "I thank you," she breathed in a husky voice. "My fiancé was the king's favourite knight." "Who will be his successor?" Holmes probed, looking at her with interest. "Either Grendador or Huckevolk. I despise them both." "Has either of them harassed you?" "No, every knight is engaged and does not harass any other maiden," she explained bravely. "And did you see either of them yesterday after you left Sir Craskadin's chamber?" "No, it was dark, and I walked back to my chamber with a torch." Now, Dr. Watson wanted to find out something else. "Has anyone threatened the noble knight?" "No, everyone feared him," she replied, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye with her sleeve. "Tomorrow he will be laid to rest." "Rest assured that I shall find the perpetrator," Holmes promised her. "Today I shall compete in the fencing tournament." "Then I wish you victory, noble sir," she said with a sniffle as she left the half-dug grave. As soon as she had gone, a small man appeared wearing a tall black hat, his clothing also gleaming black. "Greetings," he addressed the Englishman. "Who is participating in the tournament?" "I will," boomed Holmes, pointing to his rapier. "Then let me take your measurements." The man hurried to measure Holmes's height with a measuring tape. "Aha! A suitable coffin is already waiting in my storage for you. What is your name, which I shall put on the gravestone?" "That won't be necessary," Dr. Watson interrupted him irritably. "Mr. Holmes is a master of this sport and will win the duel." "Well, I certainly hope you're right, my friend," Holmes muttered as he walked away, leaving the astonished little man standing there. In the spacious marketplace at the heart of the village, preparations were already underway for the upcoming folk festival. The tournaments here clearly provided a welcome diversion from the dreary daily routine, much like theatre performances or sporting events on planets elsewhere. Young squires were cordoning off a large circle with a rope adorned with fluttering blue and red pennants, where the action would soon take place. Several horses were already being saddled. The horses in these parts looked like those on Earth, except they had drooping ears and cow-like tails. Moreover, they didn't neigh, but rather made occasional croaking sounds. A rather tall man in metal armour with a matching helmet was walking leisurely towards Holmes. "My honourable name is Huckevolk, and so you are the strangers who've wandered in and already made yourselves popular with Salmanzar. What do you make of our tournaments?" inquired the knight, whose mouth had an oddly paralysed quality, as though he were suppressing a yawn. "A need for desperate cheerfulness," pondered Holmes whilst massaging the bridge of his nose, "although I admire anyone who can genuinely laugh about it. Only the winner will be laughing afterwards, and that will be me. I doubt whether you'll win against Grenador with your sword. I don't care if you kill him, he bores me to death." Huckevolk now gave in to his urge to yawn. "If you want a doctor's advice, noble knight," Dr. Watson remarked, "then perhaps you should lie down for a short rest. You look rather tired." Suddenly, a fanfare, produced by musical instruments similar to alpine horns, echoed across the square. It thundered in everyone's ears, much like the trumpets of Jericho might have sounded. "Too late for sleeping," Hookervolk muttered, whilst drumming encouragingly on his metal breastplate. "I feel fresh and shall be the first to step forward." "You'd better lie down," Holmes now also urged him emphatically. "Out of the way!" he bellowed at him, nearly running him over as he made a hasty dash towards his horse. "What a barbarian!" Sherlock Holmes scolded. "Come along, Watson. Let's step aside and watch how they fight here." Without further ado, the tournament began as soon as the king and his court had taken their seats in a stand at the side of the field. Hookervolk, on his white stallion, charged against the black horse of a knight whom the crowd loudly cheered on with shouts of "Fellows! Fellows!" lifted him out of his saddle with his lance, whereupon the stricken fellows crashed to the ground with a loud clatter and remained lying there. Two squires with a stretcher collected the defeated knight and carried him swiftly out of the flag-lined arena. Most of the nobles and the king cheered frenetically. Whether from guilty joy or thirst for sensation remained unclear. This spectacle repeated itself 3 more times with different participants, and the victors received the king's congratulations and caught kisses blown by their favourite castle maidens. Then a fanfare sounded anew. It seemed to announce a change in the programme. "Now Sir Grenador will skewer the stranger," Trunda shrieked ecstatically and blew a kiss to her suitor. "No mercy for the upstart," bellowed Hookervolk from the background. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, high above an eagle circled, and Grenador, slightly bow-legged, approached Holmes in gleaming armour, already drawing his sword from his belt. "En garde!" called out the great detective to him, assuming the usual fencing stance. The blades clashed with a continuous cling, 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 as the 2 equally matched opponents met each other's swords. At times, the crowd would gasp, "Ah!" and "Oh!" during particularly dangerous manoeuvres, but soon everyone held their breath, especially when Sherlock Holmes managed to disarm Grenador with a powerful thrust, sending his sword flying from his hand. The knight hesitated for a moment, glancing at his weapon, contemplating whether to retrieve it, but decided otherwise, and lunged at Holmes, attempting to strangle him with both hands. Holmes, however, had anticipated this and ducked, causing Grenador in his cumbersome armour to fly over him and crash hard onto the sandy ground. A small cloud of dust obscured his vision as he stood up again, only to be struck precisely on his left knee by Holmes's sword, sending him back to the ground. "Kill him!" shouted Miss Ventali enthusiastically from the stands, but Holmes merely feinted at the knight's throat and spoke mercifully. "I spare your life, Sir Grenador. From now on, do only good." The crowd had never experienced anything like it. Some booed, others clapped, and the noble castle maidens used rather unladylike words to share their opinions with one another. Finally, the king put his foot down. "Knight Holmes has won the victory and shall dine at my table at 7 o'clock. Moreover, he still owes me an important message. The tournament is over." Grenador scrambled to his feet and limped away with his head bowed. Dr. Watson hurried to Holmes and brushed a few specks of dust from his doublet. "Brilliant, my friend," he praised him. "But what do you intend to tell the king, since we haven't even been able to catch the murderer yet?" Just as in fencing, one can also employ a feint when dealing with one's fellow men, Holmes whispered to him conspiratorially. "All I need is a piece of paper and an envelope. Surely such things can be found here as well." The gentlemen freshened up in their guest room at landlady Francine's establishment, who, having watched the tournament from the cheap seats, naturally, rewarded the victor with a tankard of beer for his troubles. He shared this brotherly with the doctor. From the innkeeper, he also received a piece of parchment, which he inscribed with a quill dipped in green ink, possibly extracted from green goat's milk, and then carefully folded the document into an envelope. Dr. Watson could make neither head nor tail of it, but trusted in the mental faculties of the formidable detective. The red dwarf in the sky slowly sank, heralding nightfall. In the great dining hall of the castle, festivities were already in full swing when the Englishman arrived punctually at 7 o'clock. all the noble knights wearing their ceremonial armour sat at a long table with their lavishly adorned ladies, drinking beer. Only before the king, who wore his crown in honour of the occasion, stood a small bowl of chamomile tea, which he was contentedly sipping. When he recognised the two visitors, he waved to them cheerfully and then addressed Holmes. "Detective, who is the murderer of Kraskadine?" After Salmanzar IV had uttered these words, absolute silence fell upon the brightly torch-lit room. One could have heard the proverbial pin drop had one been at hand, or rather, had one fallen from someone's hand. All eyes turned to Sherlock Holmes, who held up his brought document in triumph. "Here in this letter is written his name, and also the proof of the cowardly murder," he declared boldly, and handed it with a triumphant expression to one of the knights who sat near him at the end of the table. "Pass the letter on to His Majesty the King." As commanded, one knight passed the letter to the next seated knight until it reached Grenador, who hesitated briefly before passing it on, until the carefully folded parchment reached Hukevolk. He jumped up indignantly and waved it about angrily. "Fraud, my king! The stranger is a liar!" he bellowed at the top of his voice. "You should not believe him." "But Hukevolk," Salmanzar IV wondered at this, "you don't even know yet what is written in the letter." "But your Majesty," exclaimed Holmes, "for otherwise he would not be getting himself so worked up." Now, Hukevolk could no longer contain himself and tore open the letter, reading aloud, "It was you!" "Indeed, you have betrayed yourself, Sir Hukevolk," Holmes exclaimed with delight, pointing at him dramatically. "I knew the murderer would snatch this telling letter before the king had a chance to read it." At that moment, the wicked knight realised his folly, tossed the letter over his shoulder, and bolted like lightning along the table towards the exit. "After him!" commanded the king in agitation, whereupon all the knights sprang into action, knocking over several chairs, and chased after the villain. "And you have my royal gratitude, detective." They had to settle for the thanks, with no payment forthcoming. Holmes and Dr. Watson each had another tankard of ale, enjoyed being admired by the serving wenches, and then took their leave of the ruler without making any further attempt at conversion. "I'm not cut out to be a saviour," Holmes confessed to his friend as they left the fortress and headed back towards the gnarled oak. "Oh aye, you mustn't go to the oak," warned the taller guard, "for it is bewitched. An evil spell dwells within it. Keep away from it." "All right, we'll walk straight past it," Dr. Watson promised him from a distance, and muttered quietly, "Well, at least I managed to work the effects of chamomile into their folk beliefs." "And I was able to bring a wrongdoer to justice," Holmes mentioned contentedly. In the darkness, they could barely see their hand in front of their faces, but suddenly one of the neighbouring planets, illuminated by the setting sun, emerged from behind a cloud and cast enough light upon their path that they could make out, at roughly 30 metres ahead, the military underworld's entrance disguised as an oak tree. "We could have at least made an attempt to guide the people a bit onto the righteous path of faith," the doctor reproached himself more than anyone else. "That's the task of a new religious founder, which I have no desire to be," Holmes revealed to him. "And you have no talent for that either, Watson." "I suppose that's true," admitted Dr. Watson. "At any rate, the people don't seem particularly unhappy. They believe in a higher being and have simply given it a name that's foreign to us." Only 15 metres separated the Englishmen from the safety of the oak tree when the murderer, appearing as if from nowhere, blocked their path. Knight Hukevolk had managed to escape his pursuers, and now he grinned devilishly, armed with a sword. The broad blade gleamed in the light of the illuminated planet above him, rivaling the glint of his teeth. "Yes, come right here, you foreign rabble," he greeted them. "Because of you, I'll have to live with a guilty conscience for the rest of my life." "Good Lord," Dr. Watson clasped his hands together. "The murderer is here." "Ha ha! Did you really think you could escape my revenge?" he sneered with narrowed eyes. "Fight for your miserable lives." "That's not fair," the doctor mocked and stepped back uncertainly. A broadsword against a rapier, Holmes added. And what's more, there are two of us against just one. Ha ha ha! The laughter of the wicked henchman made both gentlemen shudder. I'll give you credit for your courage, Holmes, but it won't help you. Try to reach the oak tree, Watson, Holmes whispered, then called out loudly. Your Raumus Shippus shall punish you with eternal damnation. Ha ha ha, laughed Huckervolk. If he even exists, he won't interfere. He didn't object either when I sent that vain Kraskardin to the afterlife. After Sherlock Holmes had drawn all the attention of the criminal knight to himself, Dr. Watson was already sneaking towards the gnarled oak tree to seek entrance. The knight Huckervolk swung his sword with murderous intent, but missed his target each time, as Sherlock Holmes was remarkably nimble. You really ought to get some sleep, the detective kindly suggested to him. Let's continue our fight tomorrow. Do you take me for a complete fool? There will be no tomorrow for you. Rah! He screamed at the top of his lungs, charging at Holmes, who skillfully dodged and managed to trip him up. Crash! The knight fell to the ground with a clatter, unable to get up in time, allowing Holmes to sprint to the oak tree, which Dr. Watson had already opened by looking through the peephole. He quickly slipped inside and slammed the door behind him. As Huckervolk approached in his rage, Holmes pressed the red button. The Englishman watched with great pleasure on the display screen as an electric shock incapacitated the cowardly murderer. The conductive metal armour allowed the current to achieve its full effect. Well, this unpleasant fellow got his just deserts, grumbled the doctor, though we haven't received our rightful payment. Not to worry, I still have some gold coins in my pocket. We shall certainly keep those. Moreover, we can collect our betting stakes in Bitcoin. So let us take the splendid train back to the modern people in uniform. Holmes's voice still sounded slightly out of breath. For I have truly had quite enough of the Middle Ages with all its discomfort. In the underground military station, they had been able to follow almost the entire scenario without gaps. The colonel and his men were even able to monitor the matter with the letter through a lark perched at the window. The colonel was particularly pleased that the perpetrator was the same one who had cost one of his men his life. He gladly expressed his appreciation to the Englishman from the past. Bring our heroes back aboard the Ultimo 1, and whilst you're at it, fetch a kilo of bromesium, Sergeant Canfield, ordered the colonel with glassy eyes, though it wasn't clear whether he'd already sampled some or was simply moved by the success of his guests. In ancient Rome, they said, give the people bread and games. Nowadays it seems one must give them bromesium and tournaments, Holmes concluded. And beer, Dr. Watson added with a smile. You were listening to Pomej, Criminal Nights on Kepler-186F. Sherlock Holmes, The Galactic Cases, Episode 5, based on the characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go Audio production